us online from anywhere around the world you may be. My name is Pablo. I am a student here at Regent. Welcome from Vancouver, this beautiful land that we have the blessing to call home, from which we acknowledge that Regent College sits in the traditional, unceded, ancestral territories of the Musqueam First Nations peoples. Tonight we are in for a great lecture, one of the many lectures and events that we continually host here at Regent. If you would like to know more about these events, other resources that we have, and other information that we have available, all you have to do is to subscribe to our newsletter updates. When you subscribe, you will be always aware of what's happening here at Regent. If you have not subscribed already, all you have to do is to grab one of these little blue cards that we have all the way back to the Buy the Donations box. When you do that, on the blue side, you can follow the link and you can register yourself digitally online. The other option is to flip it around, and on the right side, you can enter your name and your email address. By doing so, we will register you from our end. Either way, this is the best way to always be aware of what's happening here at Regent. Before we start, if you have any electronic device that may produce any sound, now is the time to put it in silent mode. If it buzzes, rings, or dings, this is the time to put it in silent mode. We would not like to be interrupting our lecture tonight. Lastly, those of you who join us in person, please be reminded that we are recording and live streaming this lecture under the conditions spelled out by the public notice posted on the door as you enter this chapel, as you enter Regent College. At this time, I would like to introduce Professor Dr. Jeff Greenman. He is our president here at Regent and professor of theology and ethics, and he will be our host tonight. Professor Greenman, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Let me add my welcome. Good evening. Beautiful night in Vancouver. Hello to all of you around the world. So my job is to introduce our speaker in just a minute, but then also tell you what our format is for tonight. It's the same one that we use for evening public lectures regularly. So if you've been here before, it'll be the same format. Our speaker will address us for around 45, 50 so minutes, unrushed, and then there'll be a time for question and answers. So as you listen, think about what are the questions you'd like to ask. And when the time comes, you can go to the top of the stairs, please, where there's microphones so that we can all hear the questions that you have. And if you're joining us online, there's a way for you to send in your questions as well. And Pablo will gather them up and can bring them forward. Questions at regent-college.edu. And those of you in the room can use that too if you're very bashful and don't want to go up to the microphone. Questions at regent-college.edu. So that's our procedure for tonight, and then we'll be done by 9 o'clock at the latest. Afterwards, the bookstore is open if you want to start doing your Christmas shopping. Always to be recommended. So let me introduce our speaker. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Aubrey Buster from Wheaton College near Illinois. This is her first time teaching at Regent. Many of her colleagues from Wheaton College you've heard if you've come to summer schools in the past and or evening public lectures. But this is her first time, so we're really delighted that you're here. You might not know about her that her undergrad is actually in music and voice in particular. So if you're lucky, she'll sing us a song. How about that? She doesn't know I was going to say that. But some people seem enthusiastic about that, Aubrey. So. And then she got on the path of biblical studies and did a PhD at Emory University in Atlanta, and is in her teaching and scholarship focusing around the Psalms and Chronicles and Ezra-Nehemiah and Daniel, which you'll hear about tonight, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. So with no further ado, let's welcome to speak to us, as you see on the screen, Daniel 12 and the Hope of Glory, her topic tonight. Let's welcome Aubrey Buster.
Thanks so much, Jeff. It has been such a pleasure to be back here. One element of my story that Jeff didn't say is that the last time I was here, I was about 7 years old. So it's about 30 years ago, so it's a little bit of a homecoming, and it's just as fun to be with you here now as it was when I was a child. So I'm really looking forward to sharing with you some of this material in the book of Daniel. Over the past 7 years, one of my major areas of research has been the book of Daniel and the apocalyptic literature of early Judaism and Christianity. So you might say that from where I stand, I see the end of the world everywhere. On the one hand, this could be a very depressing viewpoint, but fortunately for the book of Daniel, the end of the world is glorious. But it happens to be the case that my captivation with the apocalyptic vision presented in the Old and New Testaments of the Christian Bible was not always something that was naturally appealing to me. As a child, the hope of the Christian life, promises of heaven, and the biblical images of the apocalyptic literature just weren't attractive. The idea of being dressed in white for all of eternity in the company of elders, this is just stressful for a child. My imagination was captivated by other stories. I longed to live in Narnia, where there were talking animals and children fought and won battles against vicious monsters, and they ended their days in the company of Aslan. I was attracted to Tolkien's vision of Middle-earth and the idea of sailing across the sea to Valinor. These were the grand endings that captured my imagination. In fact, when I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, having recently finished the Chronicles of Narnia, I remember I was on an airplane and experienced turbulence for the first time, and I thought, this is it. Right? This is what it feels like when a plane is going to crash. I am about to die. And I turned to my mom as I was contemplating my imminent death, and I said, Mom, it's okay that we're going to die, because when we die, we'll go to heaven, and I'll get to meet C.S. Lewis. Now, I've changed since then, just a bit. I'm happy to say that Jesus is solidly in first place on my list of people to see in the renewed heavens and earth. But still, as a child, I knew I should desire the endings described in our sacred book rather than my adventure stories, but I didn't. And it turns out that I'm not alone. The apocalyptic literature, which includes in our Bibles the books of Daniel and Revelation, and outside the Bible, books like Enoch and Baruch, has often posed a challenge to its modern readers, who sometimes identify not only their discomfort, but their repulsion. I'm going to give just a couple of examples. These are two authors writing on the eschatological teaching of Jesus, and they describe the following. They write, "Our Lord's eschatological teaching often repels modern critical students rather than attracts or impresses them. This repulsion has two roots. The Jewish apocalypticists spoil the symbolic language of the prophets for their readers. They turn poetry into prose, and the old language becomes stale, flat, and unprofitable. By the time that the modern critical student has worked through Enoch and similar books, he has had enough apocalypse for a lifetime." We'll see if my students in Daniel feel this way on Friday. "The backwater of apocalyptic has spoilt for him the living stream of prophecy." Or another author, "This dwelling on fantastic nightmares, this conscious excitement of anxiety and fear, this deliberate indulgence in an emotional expectation of the end of the world, coupled with the hammering on the theme of apocalyptic's secret knowledge, its concealment from the multitude and its delivery to the wise, the pride of the elect, and the contempt for the massa damnata, indeed, the positive thirst for revenge and pleasure in the destruction of the wicked, all these things are heavy shadows on the picture, otherwise so radiant, of universal perfection. And they are a blot on the apocalyptic writers who created them." In fact, while the term apocalyptic itself comes from the Greek term apokalypsis, which means revelation, the term apocalyptic in popular parlance has come to mean something disastrous, a crisis, or else something weird or fantastic. Even Lewis, whose stories so captivated me as a child, in his article discussing Jesus' second coming, admits his lack of attraction to the genre as a whole. The very name, apocalyptic, he writes, assigns our Lord's predictions of the second coming to a class. There are other specimens of it, the Apocalypse of Baruch, the Book of Enoch, or the Ascension of Isaiah. Christians are far from regarding such texts as Holy Scripture, and to most modern tastes, the genre appears tedious and unedifying. Now, this group of texts is admittedly weird. It features grotesque, monstrous beasts, talking horns, some wheels with eyes, bowls of plagues, strangely specific number calculations. Tonight, I'm not going to address all of the difficult features of apocalyptic language. Instead, I want to focus on one aspect in one text, and this is what I'll call the problem of glory in Daniel 12. Lewis identifies the problem with glory. There is no getting away, he says, from the fact that this idea of glory is very prominent in the New Testament and in early Christian writings, of which I'd include the Old Testament. Salvation is constantly associated with palms, crowns, white robes, thrones, and splendor, like the sun and stars. All this makes no immediate appeal to me at all. And in that respect, I fancy I am a typical modern. Glory suggests two ideas to me, of which one seems wicked and the other ridiculous. Either glory means to me fame, or it means luminosity. As for the first, since to be famous means to be better known than other people, the desire for fame appears to me as a competitive passion, and therefore of hell rather than heaven. As for the second, who wishes to become a kind of living electric light bulb? And it's this problem I want to look at tonight. Who wishes to become a kind of living electric light bulb? My goal is to present a rereading of just one of these images of glory, and the most explicit in the book of Daniel, and that is the description of the fate of the wise in Daniel 12, verses 2-3. This is our translation for the commentary, mine and John Walton's, who are co-authoring this together. Many who sleep in a land of dust will awaken, some to enduring life, and others to utter shame, to enduring loathsomeness. The wise will shine like a luminary of the heavens and will lead many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. This text is often treated as one of the earliest references in the Bible to resurrection from the dead in verse 2. And then in verse 3, the description of the stars in heaven is taken to be a description of the state of the body when it is raised. It is clear that the first verse is referring to an awakening from death. But what I want to focus on, what follows, is the description of the resulting glory. As Lewis noted above, the concept of luminous glory is difficult to translate into our present context. Who wants to be thought of as a living electric light bulb? Or perhaps in this case, who wants to be thought of as a living, flaming ball of gas? What distinctive message of hope is this trying to convey? In what follows, I'm going to begin by attending to the details of this verse, its grammar and vocabulary. I then investigate the cultural significance of star imagery for the community who authored Daniel, and I want to articulate the way that the cultural significance makes sense of some of the enigmatic textual details. Finally, I will return to the book of Daniel as a whole to demonstrate how this rereading of chapter 12 helps to illuminate, pun intended, the message of the book as a whole. Now, as I said, this text is often, there's my plan. This text is often described as one of the first and only clear references in the Hebrew Bible to a post-mortem state and to awaking from the sleep of death. The evidence for this claim is made from several features of this text. It refers to those who sleep in a land of dust. Death is elsewhere refers to as a state of sleep, though the distinction between mere sleep and the sleep of death needs to be determined contextually. This verb, yashan, can mean both just normal falling asleep at night and also the sleep of death. It's clear, though, in several contexts that it's referring to death. In Job 3:13-14, the text reads, "For now I would be lying down in peace. I would be asleep and at rest with kings and rulers of the earth who built for themselves places now lying in ruins." Or even more clearly in Psalm 13, verse 4, look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. In Daniel 12:2, the fact that this sleep is the sleep of death is made clear by the specification of where this sleep occurs, in the land of dust. Dust is connected to death through the practices of burial, because the disintegration of the body results in dust, and the place of the dead is therefore often characterized as a place of dust. We also see this in comparative texts where the Akkadian Beit Epri, literally the house of dust, is the name for the netherworld. And this is why we've translated Adamat Afar as land of dust. Here are some biblical texts in which dust is used to describe the place of death. Job 17:16, will it go down to the gates of death? Will we descend together into the dust? And most relevant to Daniel 12, Isaiah 26:19, but your dead will live, Lord. Their bodies will rise. Let those who dwell in the dust wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead. Isaiah 26:19, which the author of Daniel 12 is almost certainly drawing on, also includes the same term for awake found in Daniel 12. So the author of Daniel 12 is clearly referring to a further fate for those who have died. It's admittedly more rare for the word awake to be used for raising from the dead, though it does occur. Its rarity is probably not due to the fact that awakening is a strange metaphor to use for coming to life, but because it's rare to refer to coming to life. So thus it's clear that Daniel's referring to a post-mortem awakening, that those whose death has been described in the previous chapter, that this is not the end of their story. And this is good news, because the community to whom this text was written was experiencing terrible persecution. Daniel 11, verses 33-35, the end of the previous chapter, hints at this reality. It reads, the wise among the people will instruct the many, and for a time they will fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, and by pillaging. When they are being felled, a little help will come, and many will join them when it's expedient, persuaded by smooth speech. Some of the wise will be felled for refining among them, to purify and cleanse until the time of the end, for there is yet an appointed time to come. We note that the wise of Daniel 12, those who are awaking from their sleeping in the dust, are the same wise who are described here as falling by sword, by flame, by captivity, and by pillaging. Daniel 11, in its reference to being felled by the sword, by flame, by captivity, and by pillaging, is likely referring to a similar set of events as those described in the book of Maccabees, which describes the horrors of the persecution under the Seleucid Empire, and in particular Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Part of the book of Maccabees describes this situation in this way. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. But many in Israel stood firm. Thus, the hope that is described in Daniel 12 is for those wise who are experiencing this fate, those who are falling to the sword in this time. Their hope is that Antiochus IV Epiphanes does not determine their end or the end of their story. And this is good news, because the company to whom this text was written was experiencing such terrible persecution. What is perhaps more difficult to understand in Daniel 12 is the following description in the verse. that when those awaken from the dust, some will awaken to enduring life, and others to utter shame, to enduring loathsomeness. It's often assumed that this text is referring to final judgment and bodily resurrection, and that the description of one group like the stars is a description of the resurrected body. Indeed, that description occurs elsewhere in Christian scriptures, in places like 1 Corinthians 15, and so it is understandable that people read that later text back into this one. The assumption is then often made that Daniel is referring to this reality, that after the dead are raised from the dust of the earth, they will be judged, the righteous and the wicked, and the righteous will be given glorified bodies that shine like stars. There are several issues with this interpretation, however, issues that suggest that this text might have a slightly different message. The first is the indication is that this text refers to a partial scope. It is describing only the fate of some. Many, but not all, will awake from their sleep in the dust. This is strengthened by the distributive use of the two relative pronouns, translated here, some to this, and some to this fate. There is also a partitive min that I haven't included it here. It says many of this class of people. So it's part of a class of people who are raised in this case. Resurrection in both Judaism and Christianity is later understood to be universal in scope. But what Daniel is focusing on is only the fate of some. Many, but not all, will awaken from the land of dust. Well, this may be explained as a matter of selective concern only for a particular group, the righteous, Jews, or those experiencing persecution under Antiochus. The selective resurrection of the dead does differentiate Daniel's presentation from later Jewish and Christian presentations of resurrection. The second detail is the description of the nature of the destinies, what these parties awake to. When we read this text in light of the Christian doctrine of resurrection, we expect this phrase to read that some are declared wicked and therefore punished, and others righteous and rewarded. The verse instead begins, as we expect, begins by describing the fate of the first group, some to eternal life. We expect, therefore, that the fate of the other group will be something like eternal damnation or judgment. Instead, the text says that they will be raised l'harpot l'dir on olam, to utter shame and enduring loathsomeness. This is somewhat surprising, as instead of perpetual punishment, the verdict has to do with perpetual shame. That is how one party is perceived. And this might be the first clue that these two verses are not simply an early metaphorical description of the Christian doctrine of bodily resurrection and postmortem judgment. It's possible then that while these verses, while of course not contradicting the Christian doctrine of resurrection, are highlighting another aspect of good news for those who have died. And here we get to what I think is the key piece of this verse. The wise are described as Yahiru Kazohar Harakia, the wise who will shine like a luminary of the heavens. Oh, let's go back here. Oh, did it come? Oh, yes, here. So many commentators take the description of the wise shining like a luminary of the heavens as a description of the glorified body. Joyce Baldwin says they shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, clear and transparent. She continues, the idea behind the simile like the stars is that these faithful believers radiate light and thus help others to see, not that they should be in any way spectacular. Goldingay writes, it envisages a life of a heavenly character, the life of eternity, the discerning share in the theophanic glory of the new Jerusalem. And Paul Tanner writes that the imagery looks at the glory of these resurrected righteous ones will have in the Lord's kingdom, a glory that they will enjoy not merely temporarily, but forever and ever. In each of these cases, the scholars are attempting to identify what it might mean to shine like the stars of the sky. And in each case, they emphasize that the metaphor is one of luminosity, great light. And then they seek to translate this concept for a modern audience. It's an admirable goal. Yet, there are a few hints in this text that lead us in another direction. The first is the verb that is typically translated as shining. This verb, zahar, can mean either to shine or to warn. And in every other instance of the verb in the Hebrew Bible, it means to warn. The only instance in where it's used to shine is in Daniel 12, and that's likely due to the force of the next word, zohar, which means luminary, and thus it's translated in light of that word luminary. Here are some examples, just a handful of the many. In Exodus 18:20, this verb indicates that Moses is to warn them about the statutes and instructions and make known to them the way they are to go. In 2 Kings 6:10, "Mortal, I have made you a sentinel for the house of Israel. Whenever you hear a word from my mouth, you shall give them a warning from me." This is the same verb. "If, however," this is Ezekiel 3:21, "if, however, you warn the righteous not to sin, and they do not sin, they shall surely live, because they took warning." And then in Psalm 19:12, "By them your servant is warned," and by them is by the law, the instruction of the law. "In keeping them there is great reward." And we should note, too, that at the beginning of that psalm, it's the heavens that are first declaring the glory of God. Indeed, the only reason that the verb is translated as shine here is because the noun brightness, zohar, which is made up of the same consonants as the verb zahar. And in the next line, when it describes the masculine as stars, we naturally associate stars with shining. Furthermore, what could it mean to warn like a luminary in the heavens? And yet, the next line emphasizes, once again, the pedagogical role, the teaching role of the awakened masculine, the wise. They are described as shining or warning, like stars. I think that is a wordplay. And then they are described as the matzdikei harabim, those who lead many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. One of the reasons that we typically treat this passage simply as describing a metaphor for luminosity is that we don't have a sense in our cultural context of the stars as teachers or moral guides. The situation is very different, however, for the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel bridges two settings: the Neo-Babylonian court of King Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century BCE and Hellenistic Judaism of the 2nd century BCE. In both contexts, the stars were understood to convey divine messages to the community and to preserve reminders of the fate of the righteous and of the wicked. The stars were a mode of revelation. In Mesopotamian culture, the culture of the Babylonian setting in the 6th century, the stars were considered akin to a celestial script. The stars in the sky had long been considered, as Francesca Rochberg emphasizes, heavenly writing functioned as a poetic metaphor that extended beyond ideas of astrology or celestial divination. Indeed, she writes, the notion of the stars as a heavenly script implies their capacity to be read and interpreted. Representing the work of the divine, the stars, written in the sky, as they were conceived to be, could convey the sense of the eternal. Assyrian kings used astroglyphs, which were symbols corresponding to the constellations, to represent the words in the royal name. They wrote their name in stars. Inscriptions, including several of Nebuchadnezzar II's, describe the beauty of the earthly temple as shining like the writings of the heavens, referring to the stars. The metaphor of heavenly writing, therefore, related the stars and the constellations to cuneiform signs, from which one could read and derive meaning, and thus expressed the idea that written messages were encoded in celestial phenomena. The stars also preserved stories. Even as early as Sumerian literature, Dumuzi's Ascent tells how when Dumuzi, lover of the goddess Inanna, as everyone was, becomes mortally ill, she requests that he be able to ascend to heaven and be stationed there, though it's not clear whether he's a constellation or something else. The old Babylonian myth, Gira and Alamatum, describes how Gira, the god of fire, rescues the land from the evil Alamatum who had brought famine and unproductive livestock. He's rewarded by being made a constellation, and his story is remembered when people look to the heavens. The villain is also translated to become a constellation, and stands for ever in ignominy. Thus, when people looked to the stars, they were reminded of both the epic feats of the heroes and the epic failures of the villains. The stars told stories. One's heroic deeds could be immortalized in the heavens. This same interest in the didactic function of stars is displayed in new forms of Greek paideia, education, that arise in the 3rd to 2nd centuries BCE. In these works, cosmology and astronomy provide revealed knowledge, which was considered ideal for education and for moral formation. The Greeks called the constellations katasterismoi, the placing of the stars. As throughout the ancient world, they believed that the gods had placed or inscribed the constellations in the heavens. For the Greeks, they believed that the gods had put the constellations there to serve as lessons on proper behavior. Often entire stories played out across the sky, traced from one constellation to the next. Theonikondos notes, most of the figures appearing in Greek constellations were placed there by one of the gods to honor and perpetuate the memory of some notable personage or deed. The examples are too many to name, but I'll just name a few. Andromeda is placed in the sky by Athena Minerva to memorialize the heroism and courage of Perseus, who slayed the Gorgon, Medusa. Centaurus is Chiron, tutor of Asclepius and Achilles, who surpassed all in justice and righteousness, wisdom and skill. Hercules himself is placed in the sky by Zeus to honor his heroism in slaying the dragon guarding the golden apples. Virgo is associated with Dike, justice, who is described first as a prophet and a teacher living on earth, one who gathered together the elders in the marketplace or the broad highway, where she urged them in prophetic tones to judgments for the good of the people. As a result of moral deterioration, she goes into self-imposed exile and becomes a constellation. Clearly, then, the stars in this context were understood to tell stories of heroes and to instruct in a variety of virtues. The heavens are also filled with villains, most of whom are considered guilty of hubris: Cassiopeia, Orion, Niobe, Arachne, Tantalus, Sisyphus. Kondos observes that the various accounts of Orion's death reflect a familiar theme in Greek myth. Any mortal who is guilty of hubris, who boasts of his prowess or otherwise challenges the gods, incurs divine retribution. The memory of them is forever tainted by the deeds that are commemorated in the stars. This would explain why the text of Daniel talks about shame and reproach, their reputation, rather than judgment or punishment that they would suffer. Now, I'm not arguing that the wise themselves who are raised are katasterized or made into constellations. Here I return to the details of the Hebrew grammar. They will be raised from the dust to shine or warn like the luminary of the heavens and like the stars forever and ever. Their stories and their teaching will be preserved as a divine sign, like the very order and movement of the stars of the heavens for all who pay attention. Here I want to turn back to the function of this passage in the book of Daniel. These verses have often been conflated with later texts like 1 Corinthians 15, which use the heavens as an analogy for a glorified heavenly body. Instead, I want to ask how this rereading of these verses helps to illuminate the distinctive message of this text in its context. First, I want to talk about the context of the historical period, and then the context of the book itself. Daniel emphasizes that the masculine, the wise, will be commemorated, honored as those heroes whose stories are preserved in the stars. The function of these stories will be to warn those who are still on earth in order to lead many to righteousness. In this way, their legacy of faithfulness will serve as guides to righteousness throughout all the ages. To understand the force of this message, we have to return once again, remember the situation into which Daniel 12 is speaking. According to the books of Maccabees, the Jewish people were not only being killed, their deaths were often made into spectacles of public execution, a form of profound humiliation. The most sacred institutions of Jewish life, the temple and the priesthood, have been desecrated. The Jewish people disagreed on how best to address this catastrophe. Some argued that they should respond with military force in order to reverse their shame and the shame of their people. And this is, in fact, how the authors of the books of Maccabees respond. The wise, however, the name of a group whose viewpoint is preserved in Daniel, apparently eschew this path. They do not seek glory through military victory, but instead seek the kind of glory we see in the stars, which function as eternal markers and teachers of divine will. According to Daniel 12, verses 2-3, they will achieve glory after death through the commemoration of their stories, visions, and their prescribed program of faithfulness. And they attribute this to a divine act. It should be remembered, of course, again, that those villains in the story are raised to shame. And what more suitable fate is there for Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who desecrated the holy place and murdered God's people? To an audience who's dying at the hands of this foe, Daniel offers the hope of eternal glory, not in the sense of luminosity, but of fame, of renown, of being held up by God as an example of faithfulness and righteousness. I would like to return to continue that essay of Lewis's in which he expresses his disillusionment with the images for glory in the Bible. After he asks who would want to become a living electric light bulb, he goes on to say, "When I began to look into this matter, the matter of glory, I was shocked to find such different Christians as Milton, Johnson, and Thomas Aquinas taking heavenly glory quite frankly in the sense of fame or good report, but not fame conferred by our fellow creatures, fame with God, approval, or I might say appreciation by God. And then when I had thought it over, I saw that this view was scriptural. Nothing can eliminate from the parable the divine accolade, 'Well done, thou good and faithful servant.' In the end, that face, which is the delight or the terror of the universe, must be turned upon each of us either with one expression or with the other, either conferring glory inexpressible or inflicting shame that can never be cured or disguised. And this is precisely the fate of the wise in Daniel, that they are upheld not by humans, not by the king, not by their fellow creatures, but are upheld as exemplars, teachers, as the wise, by God, forever and ever. This also explains the connection of the apocalyptic visions to the stories that make up the first half of the book of Daniel. In these stories, they uphold Daniel and his three companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as representatives of the wisdom embodied in the masculine, the wise. Their stories and their visions are remembered, and the particular form of faithfulness that they sought to emulate is taught every time the book of Daniel is read. The wise are commemorated and honored, while Antiochus Epiphanes, along with Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar, are shamed in every reading of the book. Like the stars, which were understood in the ancient world to contain the very writing of the gods, the book of Daniel continues to reveal the faithfulness of the masculine to generations. We do believe in the resurrection of the dead, the bodily resurrection of all, and a final judgment. And yet, I want to argue that at least part of the promised fate of the wise in Daniel is happening now. It's been fulfilled. The stories of the wise and faithful, Daniel, Azariah, Mishael, and Hananiah, are continuing to be upheld as heroes, not for military valor or for earthly power, but for faithfulness. And as such, they and their stories, their wonderful stories, continue to inspire us, the people of God, to continued wisdom and faithfulness. I like to think that this is precisely the kind of hope of glory, an adventure story featuring heroes who defeat the foe above all odds. I like to think that this is a hope of glory that would inspire even my own 7-year-old self in embracing this particular hope of glory. Thank you.
So friends, it's warm in here, isn't it? Do you want to stand up and stretch your legs?
Yeah.
Stand up and move for 30 seconds.
Let's do it.
And then we'll have your questions from either microphone. Moving is good. Some of you are obedient to the host. At least you can wave your hands if you're sitting down, right? Give me a wave. Yeah, there you go. Good, 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 good. Okay, enough for our exercise class. We'll have your questions, please. So Aubrey, let me ask you to step beyond your argument into the pages of the New Testament.
Yes.
Didn't you know someone was going to ask that?
Do I have to?
I
Can I
thought-
call in the audience?
You can call on the audience. You can phone a friend.
Yes,
You know.
yes.
I was thinking about a passage like Philippians 2, which is the shining like stars
Exactly,
passage.
exactly,
Are you going to talk
exactly,
about that? Because
exactly.
I was that's
Yes,
where my
yes,
mind
yes,
was
yes,
going.
yes.
This condemnation of the wrong kind of life and the exaltation, you might say, of the right kind of life and faithfulness and so on, and how that gets played out with this idea of stars and so on. Can you say something about that?
Exactly.
Okay.
So I think this demonstrates that the stars were a multifaceted way to talk about a lot of different ideas. They're probably used in 1 Corinthians 15 to refer to the nature of the resurrected body, but Paul seems to use the metaphor of shining like stars in terms of moral teachers really naturally. And this is because this is part of the Hellenistic environment, the idea that the stars were teachers and that those who functioned as moral exemplars would be described as shining like stars. So I think this demonstrates that the idea of this metaphor is not foreign to the writers of the New Testament either.
Yeah. Any other New Testament texts you want to refer to?
I think the story of this paper is really the story of attempting to disentangle multiple features of this good news, because we tend to want to connect texts together, and that's fun, that's meaningful, but then we also tend to assume that they're all describing the same thing, the same aspect. And so if we get star language in the New Testament, or if we get a description of resurrection in the New Testament, or in Isaiah, or in Daniel, that they all have to be they have to be conflated in some sense together. And I think what the study of this text has done for me is to suggest that even when we're reading these New Testament passages, there are multiple emphases in this profound doctrine, emphases that we sometimes miss when we just view them as pointing to a singular kind of propositional statement. The doctrine of resurrection meant more than, woohoo, we get to live after we die, great news. It also ties into these ideas of honor and shame, that those who are being shamed, even in the New Testament, who they're living under the Roman Empire, that those who are experiencing this existence of shame might look forward to something more akin to appreciation. And so these metaphors would have been live to them. They would have been meaningful to them, but we miss it on occasion.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. The gentleman up here on the side.
Thank you for your lecture. I'm really enjoying your class on Daniel.
Oh, thank you.
I was very interested in what you were saying about the stars having a message or a warning. And like you say, it's clear that the Babylonians or the Greeks saw this, and today a lot of people read their horoscopes.
Yes, exactly,
Do you think that in fact God has put in the stars a message for people that there is really, and these like astrology is a corruption of that?
Yes. That's very interesting. So let me answer that question historically first, because that's what I'm best at. Yes, I try to avoid anything post, the 3rd century CE. So it's clear that God does use the stars to communicate, particularly in contexts who practiced astrology. We have to look no farther than the birth of Christ, where the Magi come, and the Magi are these sages who are practicing the Babylonian study of astrology. They're described as coming from the East, from the place, the root, really, of celestial divination as a divinatory art. And so God says, listen, you think God speaks in the stars? I have something to tell you. And they say, it's a star. It says there's a king. And so God can absolutely use this method of communication to those who expect the gods to communicate in that way. We also often see in the Old Testament references to things like in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. We see that instance in Joshua where the sun stands still, and I'm convinced by those who argue that this is probably referring to a kind of omen that was described as the sun standing still, so that everyone looked at the sun and they were like, oh, a god is fighting a battle. So in an ancient world where people understood the stars to be describing to them the will of the deity, God clearly used this to communicate, particularly to people outside of Israel, who didn't have access to, say, the Torah or to the teaching of God through the prophets. So how does that relate to today? In terms of divinatory practices in Israel, that is the people of God in the Old Testament, are generally forbidden from engaging in some of these divination practices where you attempt to interpret the will of God in the stars. So God appears to use this to communicate to those outside of Israel who are comfortable with participating in this mode of divination. And he says, and this is where the power of the metaphor comes in, something like, I won't show my will in the stars, it's the wise, those of my people, those who are faithful, who will play this role of actually being upheld as those who communicate the will and the messages of God. Yeah, it's a great question.
If you have questions, go to the microphone. I can keep asking questions. Yeah. So I have a number of questions, but one is just about your particular interpretation, along with John Walton, who's taught at summer school many, many times, her colleague. They're writing a very long commentary on Daniel together.
Yes.
Why haven't other commentators seen this? You seem to say that a variety of folks are not seeing it.
Yeah, what a good question. I don't know, they should tell me. No, I'm not sure.
Yeah, you're not sure? Because the evidence you have of 21 times, it doesn't mean what most people are saying, is pretty good evidence that you guys are on the right track.
I think so. I think part of the reason, and here I don't want to ascribe anything to other scholars, so let me just describe broad trends. I think part of the reason is our guild tends to be a little bit divided between people who see Daniel as having really only a Neo-Babylonian background and those who only see Daniel as having a Hellenistic background. And I know for us it was the force of the combined use of celestial divination that was kind of the first key. That term Zahar was key, but it was also tied to this study that we were doing in both halves, because we end up arguing that the book is written over a long period of time. We're kind of bridging those two worlds. And so I think in part it was exposure to a lot of those texts. I'll also say that it is it's only in the past maybe 10, 15 years in scholarship that people have begun to really engage how much the astronomical teachings and astronomy teaching, not astronomical teaching, the teachings of astronomy of both the Babylonians and the Greeks began to influence Jewish thought. So we do have Judaic texts from this time period that are actually beginning to use Babylonian divination, and they describe the movements and patterns of the stars, and then they'll connect this to wisdom teaching. And the apocalyptic literature has not been very hot in this way. People have looked at this and they're like, I don't want to do my dissertation or study this like star text. But the value of this for explicating some of these different texts like Daniel has more recently been discovered. Now, this is an argument that's going to be published in the fall, and the truth is we'll see how people respond to it. And maybe we'll find out that we missed something. This is what happens in scholarship. And maybe we'll find out why no one else has argued this. But I do think that there's a growing excitement in some of the more technical apocalyptic literature that engages these astronomical texts, and an interest in both of these cultural backgrounds, Neo-Babylonian and Hellenistic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So can you pull the camera lens back for us a bit to the wider apocalyptic genre where you began? And it would seem that here, and then also Revelation, you have a persecuted people looking for hope to hang on to, and their faithfulness being commended, right? Yeah. So that seems to be very distinctive and definitive of what apocalyptic literature is doing, despite all the strange symbols and all the other things that we find kind of perplexing.
Yeah. Absolutely. So this is something that that scholars note frequently, that it appears to be a genre that arises in situations of persecution. And I do understand that. I also don't want to discount the levels of persecution that, or the levels of oppression that people were undergoing before this. So I don't want to make a causal connection. Like, if you get oppressed enough, you're going to produce an apocalyptic text. I think it also emerges in connection with things like Babylonian and Greek learning. That's why we get these kind of strange symbols and calculations, is because of the influence of the Babylonian court in particular. But the apocalyptic texts in particular do give a hope that encourages people to endure beyond the present moment. We've been talking in class about how in the court tales, the first half of the book of Daniel, God always intervenes in the present moment. So at the end of every story, God saves in the here and now the people from their fate. And in Daniel 7 through 12, that doesn't happen. And so the apocalyptic texts are asking, what is our hope when God doesn't appear to be intervening in the present moment? And that's what the apocalyptic texts express writ large, that there is a hope that goes beyond death. There is a particular glory for those who die in shame. There is a particular power for those who are disempowered throughout their entire life. And so the genre really, you talked about pulling back the lens. The genre is what pulls back the lens and say, this is just one piece of God's plan. God has this, and your story is going to end well. Yeah.
And in commending the faithfulness of the faithful in these beautiful ways, it's testimony to who God is ultimately, right?
Yes.
So one of the things your colleague John Walton has argued in this room in the past is the Bible is about God.
Yes.
God is the hero of the story.
Yes.
So there's a little bit of a tension there, potentially. Is there? Do you see a tension between God as the hero and then we're commending faithfulness as heroic?
Yeah. This is where I really love Lewis's essay. So the true kind of origin story of this particular lecture is I also got the chance to spend the earlier part of the semester studying how the apocalyptic texts were read during Lewis's time and how he was engaging those. And what struck me about that essay is the way in which Lewis demonstrates how it's part of the character of God to desire to express God's pleasure in God's people. And so when we look at the face of God, as we're encouraged to do in all of these texts, we experience God saying, well done, good and faithful servant. And what Lewis is describing in that essay, I think, is that this is what fulfills all of our desires. And so what we see when we look at God is not, let's study God as a being looking over there, walking around, oh my goodness, isn't God interesting? But when we look at God, God's face is already looking at us. And so I think we actually do learn something about the nature of God when we see God's acclamation of these suffering Judeans. And that's the good news for us. I'm not a Maskilim. Yeah, I'd love to be a wise person, but I'm not technically part of the 2nd century group who probably called themselves the Maskilim, and yet I worship the same God who works in the same way. And so this motivates me to faithfulness, even when that doesn't lead to acclaim or earthly glory. I hope.
So this is in chapter 12, but it's the beginning of chapter 12.
It is.
And I'm just wondering about, could you take us, what does this have to do with the way the book ends?
Yes. So the book ends with a call to Daniel to endure, to wait. And what the apocalyptic literature does, so apocalyptic means revelation. And I like to think that the apocalyptic literature tells us the way the world really is, and it's usually worse than we think it is. That's the reason all the monsters show up, is that it pulls back the curtain and it says the suffering that you're enduring is actually more significant than you think it is. You are dealing, to use language of that, the New Testament, you're dealing with principles and powers, principalities and powers, not flesh and blood. So it's worse than you think it is, and yet your hope is also greater than you think it ever could be. And so it gives you the strength to endure in the present moment, in any circumstance. And so the book ends to a call to Daniel to wait for a period of time. And lots of people have interpreted that particular period of time in lots of different ways. But I think what we can take it today is a reminder to endure. That's what Daniel does. And then the angel leaves. And Daniel, at least in our imagination, is in Babylon. And all of this suffering is still before him. And it's that hope of glory that motivates him to continue in faithfulness, even past the point of death.
And we live in an era of increasing persecution of the church around the world. Are you aware of ways in which that persecuted church is really latching on to these kinds of apocalyptic texts?
Yeah. So there has been a little bit of burgeoning interest in the apocalyptic literature because of the way they've recognized that it's a tool of, it's been articulated as resistance. And I think that's helpful. I'm gonna qualify that a little bit. So, because it's been articulated as a way to kind of resist the claims of powers over and against the people of God. And I think the apocalyptic literature is a tool of resistance, but it's also a tool of how do we think of ourselves as a community that's thriving. The other thing that we do when we read Daniel is it's also a message to recognize the glory of your fellow sufferer. Yes, that I was going to say to be cheesy, but it isn't cheesy. It's the whole message of the story, right? We're, again, as Lewis says, we're actually interacting with those, when we interact with the church, with those who are going to be glorified above all, who are going to be the rulers of the whole universe. And so I think it both gives them the ability to resist the claims of those in power, but then also turn within their communities and to value them as these future glorified beings.
Beautiful. Last call for questions. Let's thank Aubrey Buster for this stimulating evening. So thank you for joining us. Just a couple of little announcements, and then we'll let you chat with Aubrey after, if you wish. The bookstore is open for your Christmas shopping. This lecture has been recorded, and you can find on the Regent College YouTube channel this lecture. If you wanted to point people to it for the future, they'll all be there from the summer until August 31st. If you enjoyed tonight's session with us, I'd invite you to consider putting a little something in the donation box as you go. This is certainly as good as going to a movie, isn't it? Right? So think about a movie ticket. But there is a donation box there. And again, the little cards, if you want to stay in touch with us and we don't already have your email address and so on to get our notices, the little cards there at the table are the ways to do that. These lectures continue throughout the summer. We look forward to seeing you all again. And thank you for joining us, and good night.